Welcome to AI Paper Slop. Today we are looking at the May 2026 preprint, DiLA Disentangled Latent Action World Models out of Peking University.
Right, and this paper, it fundamentally solves the LAM trade-off in latent action models.
Which is a huge deal.
Oh, absolutely. Historically, researchers basically had to choose between highly abstract, transferable actions, which completely ruin your video generation fidelity, or, high-fidelity generation, that gives you these entangled, noisy action spaces.
Right, you couldn't have both.
Exactly. But DiLA achieves both simultaneously, and it does it without relying on explicit action labels. It uses this really clever dual pathway architecture that explicitly co-evolves latent action learning with content structure disentanglement.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so by forcing the model to predict structural layout dynamics through a tight informational bottleneck, it naturally offloads all the static visual details to a separate Mamba-based memory pathway.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does. And the result is high-fidelity video generation, highly robust cross-embodiment, transfer-like human-to-robot mapping, and a semantically structured latent action space that you can just directly plug into downstream model predictive control.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because to really appreciate the architecture here, we need to understand the exact roadblock that necessitated this paper in the first place.
Yeah, the baseline problem.
Exactly. You mentioned latent action models, or LAMs. For those listening who might be, newer to the self-supervised space, the dream right now is to build world models from the massive ocean of unlabeled video data on the internet.
Right, like just watching YouTube videos.
Exactly. We want to stop relying on explicit robotic action labels because gathering that specific teleoperation data is painfully slow. And honestly, it's just too expensive to scale.
Which is why LAMs are so appealing. They attempt to bypass the need for labels by inferring abstract actions directly from raw video. They use an inverse dynamics model, or IDM, to basically look at two consecutive frames and guess the underlying action that happened between them.
Just inferring the physics.
Right. And then they take that guessed action and feed it into a forward dynamics model, the FDM, to try to predict what the next future state will look like.
But, if it's that straightforward, we'd all have perfect world models by now. Where does this process actually break down in practice?
Well, it breaks down at what the authors define as the LAM trade-off. There is this severe tension between how abstract your learned actions are and the quality of the video your model can generate. If you want actions that are highly abstract and transferable, meaning the model understands that the pure physical concept of pushing a block is the exact same, whether a human hand is doing it or an industrial robot arm is doing it, you typically have to force the model through a really strict predictive bottleneck.
Like vector quantization.
Yes, exactly. A common approach is using VQ to force the model to learn discrete, categorized latent spaces.
Wait, let me see if I'm conceptualizing this right. If we're forcing continuous physical motion into discrete VQ tokens, is that kind of like trying to describe the fluid, continuous motion of a ballet dancer, but you're only allowed to use a limited bucket of Lego bricks to do it?
That analogy actually highlights the core mathematical failure perfectly. When you use those tight VQ bottlenecks, you inherently disrupt the intrinsic manifold of the action space.
Because it's too rigid.
Exactly. You are forcing the model to just throw away vast amounts of nuance to fit the motion into a discrete category. It wildly oversimplifies the representation.
Right.
And because the model now lacks the descriptive bandwidth to recreate smooth physics, the fidelity of your generated video completely falls apart. It just looks jittery and broken.
No wonder the generation drops. And I imagine the inverse is just as bad, right? Like if you loosen the bottleneck so you have enough bandwidth to generate a pretty video, what actually happens to the action space?
Well, you end up with a totally entangled representation. Your latent actions basically stop representing pure physical dynamics and start memorizing irrelevant visual textures.
Just to reduce the immediate loss function.
Exactly. So your learned pushing action isn't just the physics of pushing anymore. The latent representation gets contaminated with all this visual data.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it becomes pushing a red cup on a wooden table with a harsh shadow. And the moment you try to transfer that action to a new environment, say like a metal table with no shadows, the model completely fails.
Because it literally thinks the shadow is part of the physical action.
Precisely.
So to get around this, I've seen previous architectures do some pretty extreme things. Some use a disjoint two-stage training paradigm where they just throw out the forward dynamics model entirely.
Just bolt on a pre-trained diffusion model.
Yeah, like AddleWorld, just to brute force the video generation.
Yeah.
Or They try to force abstraction by strictly limiting the inputs to optical flow or depth maps.
Which works, but I mean, it's fundamentally a hack. You are hard-coding the separation of motion from visual details instead of letting the neural network learn it organically.
Right.
So DiLA steps in and fundamentally changes what the latent action is predicting in the first place. They basically move the goalposts from predict everything in the next frame to separating what it is from the how it moves.
And this is where the dual pathway architecture comes in. They split the network into a structure pathway, which handles the dynamics relevant spatial layout, and a content pathway, which handles the dynamics irrelevant visual appearance.
Exactly.
But if the bottleneck is what caused the problem in the previous models, how does splitting it into two paths actually fix the Lego brick issue?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the predictive bottleneck is no longer just a constraint that ruins your generation.
Yeah.
In DiLA, the bottleneck is the actual engine driving the disentanglement.
Wait,
Yeah. The researchers set up a system of co-evolving disentanglement and latent action learning. Instead of trying to learn latent actions from the entire massive visual feature space, DiLA forces the latent action to predict only the structural layout dynamics.
Okay, so if I'm picturing this, it's like a police sketch artist working alongside a separate colorist.
I like that, yeah.
The sketch artist is our structure pathway. They only care about the geometry of the suspect's movement. If the sketch artist tries to remember the exact shade of the suspect's blue shirt, they run out of mental bandwidth.
Right, and they mess up the bone structure.
Exactly. They mess up the mechanics of how the person walked. So DiLA just gives the shirt color job entirely to the colorist, the content pathway.
The mechanism is even more aggressive than that, actually. Because the structure pathway is tasked with predicting the next structural state through that tight information bottleneck, a dual optimization pressure emerges during training.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. To minimize its structure prediction error, the model is heavily incentivized to distill only pure motion into the latent action. It actively purges all the static visual details.
Like the high entropy information.
Exactly. Colors, lighting, textures, it drops them because they simply cannot be compressed into the low-dimensional latent action anyway.
Right.
If the model tries to keep that visual data in the structure pathway, the prediction fails and the loss just spikes.
So it aggressively throws out the static data just to save its own loss function. But I mean, if the structure pathway is just tossing all this rich visual data in the trash, where does all that color and texture actually go?
Well, it has to go somewhere.
Right. It can't just vanish if we expect the model to generate a high-fidelity video at the end.
And that leads us directly into the neural architecture. To start, they extract visual embeddings from the video clips using DynoV2.
Which provides incredibly robust, dense visual features right out of the box.
Exactly. And then those features are refined by a spatial temporal transformer. From there, it hits the fork in the road. In the structure pathway, the model first compresses the tokens into structure embeddings.
Okay.
Then the inverse dynamics model computes the abstract latent actions. But here's the critical part for a self-supervised setting. The model computes the temporal difference between these structure embeddings.
Just to clarify for everyone, by temporal difference, you mean it's literally just looking at the delta, like the mathematical difference between frame A and frame B,
Right.
to isolate what actually moves.
Precisely. The IDM uses 3D convolutions on those temporal differences. The spatial kernels capture the translation invariant global features, while the temporal kernels aggregate the context to form the latent action.
And that latent action has a continuous dimension of 256.
Okay. So then the forward dynamics model, which is just a lightweight spatial temporal transformer, takes that current structural state, conditioned on that 256-dimensional latent action, and predicts the next state's displacement vectors.
Okay, so that's the physics calculation just humming along on one side. Meanwhile, what is the colorist, the content pathway doing with all that static visual data, the structure pathway threw away?
The content pathway is acting as the visual memory. And for this, they utilize the Mamba architecture.
Oh, Mamba.
Yeah, the choice of Mamba over a standard attention-based transformer is crucial here. State-space models like Mamba give you superior parallelization during training, but more importantly, highly stable memory retention over long sequences.
Because it acts like slow feature analysis, just aggregating static features as they are revealed over time.
Exactly. To really grasp why this separation is so powerful, we have to look at it through the lens of a partially observable Markov decision process, or POMDP.
Hold on, let's define POMDP for any listeners who aren't, deep in reinforcement learning literature every day. What does that actually mean in the context of just watching a video?
Good call. In a POMDP, an agent doesn't have perfect information about the world. It only has observations. Think about a coffee cup passing behind a cereal box on a table. In the actual objective world state, the content, like the color and shape of the cup, is static. It didn't change at all. But in the agent's belief state, that content is highly dynamic because of the occlusion.
Right, the cup vanished from observation, so the agent has to constantly update its internal belief about where the cup is.
Exactly. And standard models try to calculate the physics of the movement and juggle the object permanence of a hidden coffee cup at the exact same time, which just overwhelms them.
So DiLA offloads those complex belief updates entirely to the Mamba content pathway.
Yes, because Mamba is excellent at maintaining state over long sequences. It just remembers the coffee cup exists even when it's hidden. This frees up the structure pathway to specialize purely on the immediate physics.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. This entire predictive process, the IDM guessing the action, the FDM predicting the future state, all of it is happening entirely in the latent space, which is very similar to Yann LeCun's JIPA architecture. We aren't wasting massive amounts of compute trying to reconstruct the exact pixels of the background wallpaper at every single time step.
Exactly. You are just predicting the next abstract mathematical state. It is vastly more compute efficient.
But, as we noted earlier, eventually you do need to generate a visual frame to prove the whole thing works.
Right, and that is where the fusion decoder comes in. It's a spatial attention transformer that recombines the predicted structure from the FDM, the accumulated content memory from Mamba, and crucially, the initial visual embedding from the very first frame.
Oh, the E0 embedding.
Yes. That initial frame condition supplies the high-frequency visual details that were lost during the initial Dino V2 compression. That ensures you get high-fidelity video generation at the very end.
Okay, an elegant architecture is great on a white paper. But if you're an ML engineer listening to this, you need to see the receipts. How did the authors actually prove that this functional disentanglement works in reality?
They ran some brilliant rebinding experiments. They essentially treated the model like a style transfer engine for physics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they took the structure sequence, so the motion from video A, and combined it with the content memory, the visuals of video B.
So if I take a video of someone pushing a yellow coffee cup and a separate video of someone sliding a green block, I can take the motion from the first and the visuals from the second.
Yes. The result was a generated video that perfectly executed the spatial layout and motion of the yellow cup, but applied to the colors, textures, and background of the green block.
That's incredible.
It really proved the pathways were functionally independent. But the ablation studies are where they really nailed down the underlying mechanism. Let's look at their first ablation, where they removed the IDM and FDM entirely.
Okay, what happened?
Without the latent action predictive dynamics, the model basically degraded into a standard video autoencoder. When they tried to reconstruct the video using only the structure embeddings, the ablated model retained all the appearance details.
Meaning, without that predictive bottleneck forcing the separation, the content details just redundantly leaked right back into the structure embeddings.
Exactly. Whereas in the full DiLA model, the structure embeddings retain only pure motion-related spatial layouts.
Yeah.
It proves definitively that the predictive bottleneck is strictly necessary.
So what about the other side of the architecture? What does this all mean for the baseline? If we remove the content pathway completely and force the model to rely solely on the structure pathway, does it just regress back to the exact same broken LAM models from last year?
It does. The old LAM trade-off instantly reappeared. The researchers tracked the LPIPS score, which is a metric for perceptual similarity, where a lower score means the generated image looks more like the real ground truth image.
Great.
When they removed the content pathway, the LPIPS score worsened significantly, dropping from 0.344 to 0.451, and the training convergence speed also slowed to a crawl.
For the listener, what does a drop from 0.344 to 0.451 actually look like? Is the generated video just like a little bit blurrier, or is it a catastrophic failure?
It's a severe degradation. It's not just a soft focus effect.
Yeah.
A score of 0.451 means the physical boundaries of objects actually start to collapse.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a robotic arm manipulating an object might literally blend into the texture of the table beneath it. The network is trying to cram lighting, texture, and motion all into a tight continuous vector, and the result is visual garbage.
It proves the dual pathway isn't just a nice feature to get higher resolution, it is the load-bearing pillar of the whole paper.
Exactly.
That makes perfect sense. Now, you mentioned earlier that the structure pathway outputs a continuous 256-dimensional latent action. Did they actually look inside that space to see how the model organizes physical concepts?
They did. using the OmniObject 3D dataset. This is a crucial out-of-distribution benchmark because it contains perfectly controlled affine transformations.
Like simple movements, panning, and zooming.
Right. And when they mapped the continuous 256-dimensional latent space, the results were striking. Pure translation actions, like moving left or right, formed clear, continuous 2D planes, where small displacements clustered near the origin and large displacements spanned the edges.
So it was topologically isomorphic to physical motion.
Exactly. And scaling actions, like an object shrinking or growing, formed a perfectly symmetric spectrum around the identity point.
So you could literally point to a specific coordinate in this math space and say, that is the pure concept of moving left. And more importantly, do these concepts compose? Like, can you mathematically add move left and shrink together?
They compose beautifully. If you map a translation combined with a scaling action, the manifolds map together cleanly. You can visually see the mathematical structure of physical concepts operating independently but cohesively in the space.
The model learned pure physics. Okay, a beautifully organized mathematical space is fascinating for a research paper. But a robot arm interacting with a real-world messy kitchen is entirely different. Does this actually survive contact with reality? Like, if we try to use these learned representations to make a robot do something useful, does it hold up?
It does, and this is where the cross-embodiment transfer comes in. Because the latent actions are so rigorously decoupled from visual appearance, the researchers were successfully able to transfer latent actions inferred from videos of human hands manipulating objects directly to robotic arms.
Wait, so the model infers the action from a human hand and then successfully maps it to a robot gripper, entirely ignoring the fact that a gripper looks nothing like human skin and fingers.
Exactly. Because the latent action space only understands the structure of the movement, the visual mismatch of the embodiment is completely irrelevant.
That's wild.
They even demonstrated navigation transfer, moving actions learned in virtual simulations, directly to real-world physical navigation environments.
That is the holy grail for robotics. But, inference is one thing, actual planning and control is another. How does the robot use this world model to actually accomplish a multi-step task?
They rigorously tested DiLA in a model predictive control, or MPC, framework. They took DiLA, fine-tuned it as an action-conditioned world model, and hooked it up to a sampling-based algorithm called Model Predictive Path Integral, or MPPI.
MPPI basically acts as the simulator for the robot's brain, right? It uses the world model to simulate thousands of possible futures, evaluates the cost of each of those futures, and then picks the optimal path to execute.
That's the exact mechanism, and the results were definitive. DiLA outperformed state-of-the-art baselines like AdaWorld across the board.
Really?
Yeah, it was particularly dominant on complex tasks like push-button, where highly precise physical interaction and spatial planning are required. Remember, AdaWorld relies on a massive external pre-trained diffusion model to function. DiLA beat it using its own self-contained, efficiently learned latent space.
Wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the implications here for robotics are just massive. This means you could potentially train a world model on millions of hours of unstructured YouTube videos of humans opening doors, pushing chairs, picking up tools.
Right.
Then, because the physics and structure are completely disentangled from the specific visual textures of those videos, you can directly transfer those learned latent actions to a robot operating in a factory or a home environment it has never seen before.
You are bypassing the need for millions of hours of expensive teleoperation data. You are just extracting pure physical intuition from the internet.
It completely reframes how we approach self-supervised scaling for robotics.
So, to summarize the enormous ground we've covered today, the researchers behind DiLA have elegantly resolved the LAM trade-off. They proved that you don't have to sacrifice abstract transferable action learning just to get high-fidelity video generation.
Right.
By setting up a dual pathway architecture, they made content structure disentanglement and latent action learning co-evolve. The predictive bottleneck forces the structure pathway to learn pure physics, while the Mamba pathway acts as an infinite sponge for all the static visual details.
Exactly.
And the result is a continuous, highly abstract action space that can drive complex downstream robotics tasks.
It is a phenomenal step forward. But, this raises an important question for future work, especially for anyone listening right now who might be building on this kind of dual pathway architecture.
Right, the limitations.
Yeah. In the paper's limitations, the authors honestly note that DiLA is still susceptible to autoregressive compounding errors when generating long horizon videos. Over 10 or 20 frames, it's brilliant. But if you try to roll out a prediction over 1,000 frames, The physics will eventually drift and degrade.
And here's a provocative thought for you to mull over in your own research. If the Mamba pathway is already perfectly handling the long-term static memory, preventing the visual background from degrading, what architectural shift does the structure pathway need to prevent that physical drift over a 1,000-step rollout?
That's the real question.
Could we integrate hierarchical latent actions where a higher-level planner sets a broad structural goal and the low-level IDM executes the micro steps? Or perhaps we could inject sparse temporal anchors into the forward dynamics model to force it to realign with reality periodically.
Both interesting ideas.
It's a fascinating puzzle and definitely something for you to explore in your own implementations. Thanks for joining us today on AI Paper Slop. Keep diving into the data, and we'll see you next time.